The heavy oak doors of the throne room groaned, a sound that felt like a death knell to the woman standing at the periphery of the hall. Pamella smoothed the skirts of her simple blue dress, her fingers trembling as they brushed the faint, jagged scar of a rejected mate bond hidden beneath her collar. Around her, the air was thick with the suffocating musk of royal aggression and the scent of expensive, cold incense, a sharp contrast to the velvet silence she usually sought in the Omega quarters. The arrival of Alpha King Foster shifted the room's gravity instantly. He moved with the terrifying grace of a predator, his massive frame encased in dark, ornate plate armor that glinted under the flickering candelabras. A heavy cloak of midnight fur draped over his broad shoulders, framing a face that had long forgotten how to trust. To his right stood his son, Arthur, whose presence was a silent echo of his father's dominance. Clad in studded black leather, the boy's eyes were cold and guarded, mirroring the elective mutism that had become his only defense against a world that had stolen his mother. Arthur's reputation as the Silent Prince preceded him. He was notorious for driving away every high-born attendant with a violent, wordless rejection. As the royal pair moved toward the dais, the king's gaze was like a searching blade, demanding total submission from the court. Pamella kept her head bowed, trying to remain as forgettable as a discarded pearl. Yet her instincts pulled her gaze upward. When her eyes accidentally locked with Arthur's, the air in the room seemed to thin. She did not see the brat the court whispered about, nor the monster his father feared he was becoming. Instead, she recognized the hollow ache in his amber eyes, the same stark isolation that had defined her existence since her own rejection. In that suspended moment, a shared recognition passed between them, one that transcended rank and trauma, while the king's voice boomed through the hall, a thunderous demand for someone to tame his son's growing rage. Pamella found herself stepping forward from the shadows. She wasn't driven by ambition, but by the sight of a wounded creature who, like her, was simply waiting for someone to finally see him. Like, comment, and subscribe if you are enjoying this story. The transition from the grand throne room to the royal wing was a journey from public spectacle to private coldness. Pamella followed Beta Commander Thorne, her meager belongings clutched in a small satchel, her footsteps silent on the plush crimson carpets. While the rest of the palace celebrated the winter solstice, the royal wing felt like a tomb of marble and secrets. As they approached Arthur's chambers, the scent of distress became overwhelming, a sharp, ozone-like tang that spoke of a young shifter's uncontrolled power. Thorne paused at the heavy mahogany door, his expression a mix of pity and warning. "He hasn't eaten in 2 days," he whispered. The last Omega who tried to enter left with a broken wrist. Pamella merely nodded, her heart steady. She knew that rage was often just a shield for a heart that had been discarded. Inside, the room was a battlefield. A silver pitcher lay dented against the far wall, and the heavy velvet curtains had been shredded by claws too large for a boy his age. Arthur sat on the floor in the center of the wreckage, his back to the door, his shoulders hunched in a defensive line that mirrored Foster's own rigid posture. "I brought some pine-scented tea," Pamella said softly, keeping her voice melodic and low. She didn't approach him directly. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor near the door, creating a safe perimeter. Arthur didn't turn, but his fingers curled into the rug. "Go away," he growled, the voice sounding forced and rusty from disuse. It was the first test of her resolve, a verbal push to see if she would flee like the others. I was rejected once too, she said, her voice a calm anchor in his storm. I know how it feels when the silence is the only thing that doesn't hurt. Arthur's head tilted slightly. Slowly he turned his head, his amber eyes searching hers for the lie. He found only the truth of her own scars. He didn't speak again, but he reached out and took a tentative sip of the tea she slid toward him. It was a small victory, a crack in the ice that had encased the royal house for years. The transition from the prince's chaotic room to the formal corridors was marked by the sudden, overwhelming scent of cedar and aged leather. Pamella had just finished clearing the broken glass from Arthur's floor when the air in the suite sharpened, signaling the arrival of the king. Foster stood in the doorway, his massive frame nearly blocking the light from the hallway. His armor had been removed, replaced by a simple tunic that did little to hide the raw power of his alpha physique. His eyes, a stormy gray that matched the winter sky, swept over the room, landing first on his son, who was remarkably calm, and then on the Omega kneeling among the wreckage. Foster's brow furrowed in a mix of suspicion and intrigue. He had expected to find another woman in tears or fleeing in terror. Instead, he found Pamella, her movement steady and her scent strangely soothing amidst the boy's lingering distress. "You are still here," Foster remarked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the small space. He stepped into the room, his presence demanding an instinctive submission that Pamella fought to resist. As he moved closer, the proximity triggered a primal reaction. For a fleeting second, the jagged scar of her rejected bond burned, but it was quickly eclipsed by a new, magnetic pull toward the king. Foster paused, his nostrils flaring as he caught the subtle notes of her scent, wild honey and rain, underneath the palace incense. It was a scent that shouldn't have affected a man who had closed his heart to the world, yet it stirred a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He watched as Pamella reached out to Arthur, and for the first time since the tragedy, the boy didn't flinch away from a woman's touch. The tension between the king and the Omega was a physical weight, a silent conversation of lion and lamb that left Foster momentarily breathless. He looked at the rejected girl and felt an inexplicable urge to shield her from the very court that had discarded her. "See that he eats," Foster commanded, though his tone was unusually soft. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed hers, sending a jolt of recognition through both of them that promised the cold peace of the palace was about to end. The fragile peace within the royal wing shattered the following afternoon in the palace gardens. Under the watchful eyes of stone gargoyles and silent guards, Pamella sat on a low stone bench, watching Arthur trace the patterns of frost on the hedges. The air was brittle, a sharp contrast to the warmth that had begun to simmer between her and the king. Foster watched them from the balcony above, his presence a heavy weight of cedar and steel that Pamella felt in her very marrow. Arthur moved closer, his dark leather boots crunching on the frozen gravel. For the first time, he didn't look like a prince or a wolf. He looked like a boy carrying the weight of a kingdom's sin. He leaned in as if to inspect a withered rose, but his voice was a razor-thin whisper that barely stirred the air. "Don't drink the wine tonight, Pamella," he murmured, the words rusty but clear. It was the first time he had spoken a warning, and the raw fear in his amber eyes sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Pamella froze, her hand hovering over a basket of healing herbs. She didn't look at him, knowing that Silas's spies were woven into the very fabric of the court. "Why, Arthur?" she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The boy's fingers trembled against the ice. "The shadows are moving," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "My uncle. He smiles at my father, but he carries a vial of nightshade in his sleeve. He wants the throne, and he thinks you are the one who will help him take it." The revelation was a physical blow. The palace tragedy, the king's mistrust, and Arthur's elective mutism all suddenly aligned into a terrifying map of betrayal. Arthur reached out, his small hand gripping her wrist with surprising strength, his gaze fixed on the balcony where Foster stood. "He killed my mother because she knew," the boy whispered, the first tear track cutting through the frost on his cheek. "I saw it. That's why I stopped talking. But I'm talking now because I won't let him kill you too." The great hall was a sea of shimmering silk and predatory smiles, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat and the dangerous musk of hundreds of alphas. Pamella stood behind Arthur's chair, her posture regal despite the simple servant's dress that Silas's men had tried to use as a shroud of invisibility. Every muscle in her body was taut, her eyes scanning the high table where the royal family sat under the heavy weight of tradition. Silas sat to Foster's left, his face a mask of fraternal loyalty. But Pamella could see the subtle glint of anticipation in his eyes every time his hand brushed the pocket of his embroidered tunic. The ritual of the winter solstice required the king to share a cup of ancient vintage with his closest kin, to symbolize the pack's unity. As the golden chalice was brought forward, Arthur's small hand found Pamella's under the table, his grip a frantic coat of fear. The boy's elective mutism had been his armor, but tonight, his silence was a scream. Pamella watched as the royal cupbearer poured the deep red liquid, her grandmother's healing instincts heightening her senses until she could almost smell the faint, bitter almond undertone of nightshade beneath the rich bouquet of the wine. With the grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime navigating shadows, Pamella moved. As Silas leaned in to offer a toast, she feigned a stumble, her shoulder brushing the cupbearer's arm. In the split second of the stumble, her hand, honed by years of gathering delicate herbs, flicked a neutralizing powder into the king's cup while her other hand subtly jostled the tray, forcing the wine meant for the king to splash toward Silas's own glass. The movement was so fluid that only Arthur, watching with wide amber eyes, realized the exchange had happened. Foster raised the chalice, his stormy gray eyes fixing on Pamella with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He hesitated, his alpha instincts flaring at the sudden tension in the room. But he drank. Silas followed suit, his smug grin widening as he watched his brother swallow. However, as the feast continued, the color began to drain from Silas's face instead of the king's. The rejected Omega had turned the palace's own toxicity against its architect, proving that while she moved like a ghost, she struck like a queen. The aftermath of the feast left the palace in a state of stifled panic. Silas had been rushed to the infirmary, his sudden illness blamed on a bad vintage, but the heavy silence in the king's private study told a different story. Foster stood by the hearth, the orange glow of the embers highlighting the exhaustion etched into his rugged features. He looked less like a conqueror and more like a man realizing his castle was built on shifting sand. Pamella entered softly, carrying a tray of calming lavender and valerian root. She felt the king's stormy gaze settle on her before she even reached the desk. Foster didn't speak until she set the cup down. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp that sent a shiver through her rejected bond. "You tripped, Pamella," he mused, his eyes narrowing as he watched the steady grace of her hands. "A woman who moves with your precision does not stumble by accident. My son has started eating, and my brother, the man who shared my mother's womb, is currently convulsing. Explain the coincidence." Pamella straightened her spine, meeting his intimidating gray eyes with a clarity that made Foster's breath hitch. She saw the war within him, the alpha who demanded absolute control and the man who was desperately lonely in his suspicion. "Arthur is not silent because he cannot speak, Alpha," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the tension. "He is silent because the truth is a death sentence. Silas did not get sick from the wine. He got sick from his own ambition." The air in the room thickened with the scent of cedar and a sudden, sharp spark of hope. Foster moved with startling speed, closing the distance between them until Pamella was backed against the heavy oak table. He didn't reach for his sword. Instead, his large hand hovered near her cheek, his thumb grazing the edge of her jaw. "The court calls you a discarded Omega," he whispered, his thumb tracing the faint line of her rejection scar. "But you see things they are blind to. You protected my heir when I was too arrogant to see the threat." In the flickering firelight, the power dynamic shifted. The lion was no longer just a protector. He was a seeker, and the lamb held the keys to his kingdom's survival. For the first time, Foster leaned his forehead against hers, seeking the comfort of her scent. "Arthur was right about you," he breathed. "But if we are to survive what Silas has planned next, I need you to be more than a healer. I need you to be my eyes in the shadows." The Winter Solstice Ball was a masterpiece of lethal elegance, the grand ballroom aglow with the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers that cast dancing shadows against the tapestries. Pamella moved through the crowd in a gown of deep midnight velvet, a gift from Foster that signaled her rising status. Yet she felt the cold eyes of the nobility boring into her back like daggers. The air was thick with the scent of pine, expensive perfumes, and an underlying ozone of impending violence. Silas had made a miraculous, albeit pale, recovery, and he now stood on the far side of the hall, surrounded by a circle of high-ranking alphas whose loyalties had been bought with promises of power. Foster stood on the royal dais, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his gray eyes never leaving Pamella as she circled the room. He was the mountain, but she was the wind, picking up the frantic whispers of treason that the alphas thought were hidden by the orchestra's swelling violins. The coup began not with a shout, but with the sudden, jarring silence of the music. The heavy doors to the ballroom were slammed shut and barred from the outside. Silas stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. "My brother is compromised!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "He has fallen under the spell of a broken Omega, a spy who poisons our wine and our traditions." On cue, Silas's loyalists drew their blades, the steel singing a dissonant chord. Confusion turned to carnage as the rogue wolves Silas had smuggled into the palace began to shift, their clothes shredding as they transformed into beasts of war. The screams of the nobility filled the air, but Pamella didn't hesitate. She had spent a lifetime being invisible. Now, She used that invisibility to weave through the chaos toward Arthur. The boy was frozen near the dais, his amber eyes wide as he watched his father engage Silas's lead guards in a brutal, bone-crushing dance of alpha dominance. "Arthur, with me!" Pamella cried, her voice cutting through the snarls of the shifting wolves. She grabbed the boy's hand, her touch a grounding wire for his mounting panic. Foster caught her eye over the clash of steel, a silent command passing between them. Keep him alive. As the first line of palace guards fell to the traitors, Pamella pulled Arthur toward the heavy velvet curtains behind the throne, knowing that the only way to save the future of the pack was to disappear into the ancient darkness of the catacombs. The transition from the blood-stained ballroom to the tunnels of the ancestors felt like a plunge into a frozen grave. Pamella hauled the heavy tapestry aside, revealing a narrow stone door that Arthur's mother had shown him years ago. Behind them, the sounds of the coup, the wet thud of steel hitting flesh and the guttural roars of shifting alphas, became a muffled rhythmic drumbeat against the stone. The air here was ancient, smelling of damp earth, old magic, and the cold minerals of the mountainside. Arthur's grip on Pamella's hand was a vice, his breathing coming in shallow, jagged hitches as they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to drop into the very heart of the packlands. Pamella pulled a small fire striker and a bundle of dried herbs from her satchel, igniting a makeshift torch that cast long, flickering shadows against walls carved with the history of the first king. These were the ceremonial caves, a place where the Omega status was forgotten, and only the purity of the wolf mattered. "Stay close, Arthur," she whispered, her voice echoing through the darkness. The boy's elective mutism had returned under the weight of the violence, but his amber eyes were sharp with a new, fierce intelligence. He pointed toward a fork in the path, his fingers steady. He remembered his mother's map, a legacy of flight and survival that Silas had tried to erase. As they moved deeper, the blue phosphorescent fungi clinging to the ceiling began to glow, illuminating the path like fallen stars. Pamella's heart hammered against her ribs, but she didn't falter. She was no longer the discarded one. She was the guardian of the future. Every shadow seemed to move with Silas's intent, but she trusted the boy and the ancient stone. Somewhere above, Foster was fighting a war for his throne. But down here, in the silent dark, Pamella was fighting a war for the boy's soul. They were almost to the altar of the moon when a scraping sound echoed from the tunnel behind them, the unmistakable sound of a predator following their scent. The blue phosphorescence of the fungi cast Arthur's face in an ethereal, ghostly light as they reached the altar of the moon. The boy suddenly stopped, his small frame trembling not with fear but with a cold, simmering rage. He looked up at Pamella, his amber eyes reflecting the ancient magic of the stones. "The assassin behind us. He's the one who held her down," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking the silence of the caves. The truth spilled out in a jagged rush. Silas hadn't just arranged an accident. He had forced Arthur to watch as his mother was silenced for discovering the Shadowclaw alliance. "I didn't stop talking because I was scared," Arthur breathed, his hand tightening around the silver button on his tunic. "I stopped because my mother told me to stay invisible until the moon's healer arrived. She knew you would come, Pamella." The revelation made Pamella's breath hitch. Her role in this pack was not a matter of chance or rejection, but a calculated prophecy of survival. She realized then that her rejection by her fated mate had been Silas's first strike to keep her from the throne. The scraping sound intensified as a massive, scarred wolf emerged from the tunnel's mouth, its eyes glowing with the murderous intent of Silas's lead executioner. Pamella stepped in front of Arthur, her grandmother's healing knife glinting in the blue light. She was an Omega, but in these caves, she felt the ancestral power of the pack flowing into her, mending the spirit that had been discarded by lesser men. "Hide behind the altar, Arthur," she commanded, her voice no longer a servant's plea but a queen's decree. As the wolf lunged, Pamella didn't shrink away. She used the assassin's own momentum against him, dodging with the fluidity she had learned while navigating the shadows of the palace. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting to prove that a rejected heart is the hardest to break. The stone spiral staircase groaned under the weight of a god in fury as Alpha King Foster descended into the ancient dark. He was a vision of carnage, his armor shattered and his midnight fur cloak soaked in the blood of traitors, but his gray eyes were fixed solely on the blue phosphorescence of the altar of the moon. He burst into the cavern just as the scarred wolf executioner collapsed, Pamella's silver healing knife buried deep in its throat. Foster froze, the roar in his chest dying into a sharp intake of breath. He saw the rejected Omega standing over the beast, her midnight velvet gown torn and her hands stained crimson, yet she stood with a regal defiance that eclipsed every high-born Luna he had ever known. Beside her, Arthur emerged from behind the altar, his face set in a mask of grim victory. The boy didn't run to his father. He stayed at Pamella's side, his small hand resting protectively on her arm. "You killed him," Foster rasped, his voice a mixture of awe and terrifying relief. He moved toward them, his heavy boots echoing against the history-soaked stone. He didn't look at the dead assassin. He looked at the woman who had turned the sanctuary of the ancestors into a fortress. "Silas is cornered at the palace gates," Foster said, stopping inches from Pamella. He reached out, his large, calloused hand cupping her jaw with a tenderness that shattered the last of his cold armor. "But he claims you are the traitor. He claims you took my son to finish what the Shadow Claws started." Pamella didn't flinch. "He says that because he knows the truth is finally out of the shadows," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "Arthur saw everything, Foster. He saw the murder of your mate. He saw the rot in your own blood." The Alpha King's jaw tightened, a low growl vibrating in his chest that was no longer directed at the Omega. He looked at his son, and for the first time in years, Arthur didn't look away. The boy nodded once. A silent confirmation of Silas's sins. Foster turned back to Pamella, his thumb grazing the scar on her neck, the mark of a rejection that he now saw as a badge of survival. "Then let us go back," Foster declared, his alpha musk flaring with a protective intensity that shook the cavern. "It is time the pack sees what a real queen looks like." The gray dawn broke over the palace, illuminating the wreckage of the failed coup. The courtyard was filled with the collective breath of the royal pack, hundreds of wolves standing in a heavy, expectant silence as Alpha King Foster emerged from the palace doors. He was no longer the isolated tyrant. He moved with a newfound clarity, his hand resting firmly on the shoulder of Prince Arthur, who walked tall and proud by his side. but it was the woman walking on his other side who drew every gasp. Pamella still wore the torn midnight velvet, her skin stained with the dust of the catacombs, but she carried herself with a grace that silenced the detractors. Silas stood in chains at the center of the courtyard, his face a mask of panicked sweat as the king addressed his people. "For years, treason has worn the face of family." Foster's voice boomed, echoing against the stone walls. "My brother did not just covet a throne. He murdered a queen and attempted to extinguish the future of this pack by silencing my son." Arthur stepped forward. The silence that had defined his childhood finally shattered. "Silas killed my mother," the prince declared, his voice clear and unwavering. "And he would have killed me if not for the woman you call rejected." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd as the prince looked at Pamella with a devotion that no high-born lady had ever earned. Foster didn't wait for a trial. With a single swift motion of his alpha blade, he delivered the pack's justice, ending Silas's shadow reign forever. The king then turned to Pamella. In front of the entire assembly, he reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the rejection scar on her neck, not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to her resilience. "The laws of fated mates were written by men who did not understand the heart," Foster announced, his eyes softening as they met hers. "I do not choose a queen based on a bond forced by the stars. I choose the woman who bled for my son and stood for my kingdom when I was blind." The king took the crown from his own head and held it above Pamella. "The Omega you discarded is the savior of this house." He placed the golden circlet upon her blonde brow, the metal glinting in the rising sun. "Long live the Alpha Queen." As the pack let out a thunderous howl of acceptance, Pamella realized her journey was complete. She was no longer a ghost in the shadows or a discarded pearl. She was the heart of a new dynasty, a mother to a prince, and a mate by choice to a king who finally knew the meaning of trust. If you love this tale of found family and royal romance, like this video if you believe everyone deserves a second chance. Comment below with your favorite moment between Pamella and Arthur. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our latest werewolf sagas.